Good evening and welcome to Scotland at 7 here on Broadcasting Scotland. My name's Kenny McBride and I'm joined this evening by two excellent guests. Firstly by Anthony Salamone, a political analyst at European Merchants. Anthony, how are you this evening?
Fine, Kenny, how are you?
And on the other side of me we're joined by Keith Brown, MSP, Deputy Leader of the SNP. Keith, how are you today?
I'm great, Kenny, how are you?
I'm very well. And we are here, we have these two guests with us to discuss a report that Anthony published today on Scotland's route to independence. But we're going to start with the headlines. So we start, as we always do, with our coronavirus statistics update. And as of 2 p.m. today, a total of 304,973 people in Scotland have been tested through NHS Scotland labs and UK Government regional testing centres. Of these, 286,605 were confirmed negative, 18,368 were positive. There are 3 new confirmed cases of COVID-19 in Scotland, but today there have been no new deaths reported. That's the 6th day in a row with no new deaths reported in Scotland. This will, of course, be an underestimate of the total number of cases. Not everyone with the virus will necessarily display symptoms, and not all those with symptoms will necessarily be tested. However, as ever, we do encourage you, if you experience any symptoms, please do book a test as quickly as you can. Of the people who did test positive, there were 327 people in hospital last night, 2 of whom were in intensive care, plus another 10 in intensive care with suspected COVID-19. The number of patients in Scotland who have died from complications caused by the coronavirus infection now stands at 2,490. This number only includes those who have died in hospital, having received a positive test for the virus. The latest UK daily figures available show that 44,830 patients who tested positive for COVID-19 have sadly died from their illness, an increase of 11. That number does refer to deaths in all settings, not just those in hospitals. And as it's Tuesday, we also have the latest update from the Office for National Statistics for England and Wales for the week ending the 3rd of July, which was week 27 of the year. Once again, the total number of deaths for the week was slightly below the 5-year average for this time of year, although that gap has shrunk since last week. Again, deaths in care homes and hospitals were down, while deaths at home were up significantly. A total of 532 deaths were recorded in England and Wales during the week, where the novel coronavirus was listed on the death certificate. This is another decline to the lowest level for 15 weeks. For the second week in a row, though, this number is well below what would be expected based on the daily tally announced by the UK government each day. We have been in touch with the Office for National Statistics to get clarification on this, and we'll let you know as soon as we get answers. People in Scotland are being asked to continue following the public health guidance issued during the first phase of the coronavirus pandemic by using their local pharmacy, GP practice, local minor injuries unit or NHS 24 to get advice and help when they need medical care. A new public information campaign titled "Should You Go to A&E" is being launched to help make sure people continue to get the right care that they need in the right place. By continuing to follow public health guidance, people can help ensure accident and emergency departments are ready to quickly treat those who need urgent care from emergency specialists. A&E departments remain open for emergency care, with public health measures in place to protect staff and patients. However, people are being urged to consider using the NHS Inform website first, then using NHS 24 and out-of-hours GP services for non-urgent problems, or even local pharmacies for minor ailments before turning up at A&E. Places of worship will be able to reopen for congregational worship, prayer and religious life event ceremonies from tomorrow, and guidance has been published to help them prepare. Key measures include restricting total attendance to a maximum of 50 with at least 2 metres between household groups, retaining worshippers' details for contact tracing if necessary, the removal of communal prayer books, prayer mats and other shared items, avoiding singing, chanting and the playing of wind instruments, and adapting faith-specific rites and rituals to maximise safety. Full guidance can be found on the Scottish Government website. The average daily prison population in Scotland rose sharply in 2018-19 and 2019-20 despite fewer people being imprisoned, according to official statistics published by the Chief Statistician today. Following several years of steady decline, the average daily population in Scotland's prisons rose from 7,464 in 2017-18 to 8,195 in 2019-20. A total of 17,294 individuals experienced imprisonment for all or part of 2019-20, a fall of around 15% since 2010-11 when the figure was 20,407. This means that while the total prison population has fallen, the average length of sentence served has increased, in part due to the Scottish Government's presumption against short sentences. The rise in the prison population is due to growth in the population of adult men only. The average number of women in prison has remained broadly stable at around 400 since 2013-14, and the average number of young offenders, those under 21 years, continues a downward trend, falling from 865 to 326 over the past decade. Economic growth in the UK was slower in May than predicted by many economists, suggesting that recovery from the coronavirus-induced recession may be much harder than previously thought, according to a report today by the Office for National Statistics. Following a collapse in GDP of nearly a quarter during March and April, the economy grew by just 1.8% in May, against predictions of 5.5% by some City of London economists. For the year as a whole, output is expected to be between 12 and 15% lower than last year, which would be the biggest drop in the 300-year history of the United Kingdom. The Office for Budget Responsibility reported today that it expects unemployment to reach almost 12%, potentially increasing the gloom around the UK's immediate economic future. It also warned of tax increases and public sector cuts to help balance the books after the UK government's substantial borrowing to manage the costs of the pandemic. Prime Minister Boris Johnson ordered Huawei equipment to be purged completely from the UK's 5G network by 2027, risking the ire of China by signalling that the world's biggest telecoms equipment maker is no longer welcome in the West. From the end of the year, it will be illegal for operators to buy any 5G equipment from Huawei, the UK's Digital, Culture, Media and Sport Secretary Oliver Dowden told Parliament. He said the decision would mean a delay to the rollout of 5G by 2 to 3 years and add costs of up to £2 billion. The decision follows significant pressure from the US for the UK to follow it in banning Huawei's involvement in critical infrastructure, particularly in light of China's recent crackdown in Hong Kong. The US government carried out its first execution in 17 years this morning, putting to death convicted murderer Daniel Lee over objections by his victims' relatives after the Supreme Court cleared the way with an overnight ruling. Lee was pronounced dead at 8:07 a.m. Eastern Time, US Bureau of Prisons spokeswoman Christy Brashears said afterwards. His death marked the culmination of a 3-year effort by Republican President Donald Trump's administration to resume capital punishment, ending a de facto moratorium by his Democratic predecessor Barack Obama, amid legal challenges and difficulties obtaining lethal injection drugs. The execution by lethal injection in Terre Haute, Indiana, followed a flurry of legal challenges in multiple federal courts. 2 more federal executions are scheduled for later this week. And face coverings are to become mandatory in shops in England from the 24th of July, according to new rules announced today. The announcement follows weeks of mixed messages from Boris Johnson and his cabinet, with Michael Gove saying as recently as Sunday that the wearing of masks should be left to the common sense of the people. People who refuse to wear a mask potentially face a £100 fine. Face coverings became mandatory in Scotland last week. Anecdotal evidence suggests excellent compliance with no enforcement actions necessary, following strong, clear messaging from the Scottish Government. Scientists have warned that the mixed messages from the UK government may make compliance there much harder to achieve. And that does round up our headlines for today. So before we start with our discussion, I will just remind you, if you want to join this conversation throughout the show, you can do so. Follow us, first of all, on Twitter @BroadcastScot, and then join us using the hashtag Scotland@7. That's Scotland, AT, and the number 7. We will be flashing some of those tweets up on screen throughout the show. So we go first then to you, Anthony, and you have published this report today discussing how Scotland can get to independence from where we stand today. So tell us first of all, what was the impetus behind publishing this today?
Well, this report, this right to decide report, I think the genesis of it was, we've reached a point where it's important to take stock of where the independence debate is and where it's going. Obviously, we've seen opinion polls suggesting that there is clear majority support for independence. If that continues, then obviously that is a decisive shift, not only from the 2014 referendum, but even since the Brexit referendum. We've always wondered if there would be a Brexit boost for independence, and that never really quite materialized. Perhaps now it is. And at the same time, this standoff continues between Boris Johnson refusing to enable a referendum and the Scottish Parliament, and then through the Scottish Government having requested one. So I think it's important for us to think about how the independence debate should evolve, considering that we may be reaching a point where a majority opinion in Scotland it becomes quite decisively in favour of independence. It's a time to reflect on how to advance the debate, to increase the substance behind reflecting on what Scotland could be if it were independent.
I see. And have you been part of any of the other discussions that have been going on online? There have been blogs by everyone from Pete Wishart to Craig DL talking about different paths to independence. Did any of that influence your thinking, or have you just been in your own wee socially distanced bunker thinking about this yourself?
No, of course, I'm very interested in what everyone else has been saying over the past few weeks and months. Indeed, I think a strong part for why I want to write this report was the way in which the debate has intensified. And of course, there are always two aspects of the independence debate. One is this procedural debate, the question of whether or not a referendum should take place or how Scotland could become independent, and then the substantive debate on whether or not Scotland should be independent. Now, this procedural debate has, as I said, has intensified. I think it's important to remember that the only reason we are having to have this discussion is because the UK government rejected out of hand the First Minister's request back at the end of last year for a referendum, with the Scottish Parliament having voted for one to take place. And if the UK government had not adopted this approach, we wouldn't be here. But yes, the various discussions of different kinds of Plan B options. I think it's worthwhile, and why I wrote this report, to ensure that this procedural debate that we are having to have remains fixed on a way that would actually deliver independence, and that is rooted in the realities of how international relations work. So yes, we may want things to be in a particular way. Maybe we may want the world to work a certain way, but international relations is driven by realpolitik, by rules, yes, but also interests. And I think that it's important, considering that there is apparently majority support for independence, to remain focused on a path that would really lead to independence.
Mm-hmm. And you've been quite kind of straightforward in your report about how many options, how many plans there are that will work. So can you tell us a bit about how you see, what you see as being the only way Scotland actually can achieve independence?
Well, I think the objective, in terms of what kind of process there is, needs to result in effective independence and real independence. The First Minister has called this a credible path to deliver independence. So that means that Scotland would be able to become a sovereign state, have the full powers of the state, and be recognised by every or practically every country in the world. That is what we would want to see from whatever pathway was offered to the people for them to decide. And in my view, the only way to do that is a process that is agreed with the UK government. Because if you think about, there are really three stages to independence. One is that the people have to decisively say that they want to have independence. I think that should be through a referendum. So say we have the referendum. Then you need to think about if the vote were in favour of independence, then you have to think about the transition from Scotland now as part of the UK to being an independent state. That requires negotiations, undoubtedly a treaty with the UK government or the UK government, and negotiations require both parties to be engaged on that. And then once that were done, you'd get to recognition, Scotland wanting to be recognised by all the other states in the world, which is essential these days if you want to really achieve true independence. And across all those three stages, regardless of how we may want it to be, the reality is that those need to be done by cooperation, by consensus, by agreement between the Scottish Government and the UK Government. Now, that's not to say that the UK Government can just simply reject what the people of Scotland decide. I think the UK Government has a democratic, political and moral obligation to listen to what the people of Scotland say in terms of if and when they want to have a referendum and if they vote for independence. But it's also crucial to remember that the other states and countries of the world, they will look to what the UK's response is to Scotland wanting to become independent or voting for independence or so on, and that they will be influenced by what the UK says and does in terms of how they respond, how they might decide to recognise Scotland as a state and so on. So options which are unilateral, don't involve Scotland and the UK coming to any kind of agreement. In my view, I think we need to be clear that I don't think those would result in effective independence. And of course, we want to have whatever option is put to the people to be one that is a credible path, a real path. And I really think it's worthwhile to remain focused on that.
Mm-hmm. And Keith, if I could come to you on this, these other options that people have talked about, things like holding a referendum without agreement with the UK government, or potentially even calling some sort of national assembly that could unilaterally declare independence. The Scottish Government has steered well clear of these. Do you feel that they are completely ruled out, though, that there is no possibility of independence being achieved if we don't have some sort of agreement with the UK government?
Well, my starting point, which got me into trouble in a previous Broadcasting Scotland interview, was to say that it can't be the case that either the SNP or the wider independence movement can simply accept that the right to self-determination is vetoed by somebody else. That's the antithesis of self-determination. So we can't accept that refusal. But I agree with virtually everything that Anthony just said. The route to doing this is one which is inclusive of an agreed referendum, one which then leads to a recognition of the result by the parties involved, and then by the international community, should that result in a yes vote and an independence. The issue before that, of course, is what happens if and when the UK government continues to say no. And I don't believe we can just accept that. And at that point, and indeed before that point, as is happening now, a number of other things have to be considered. But I think they should tend to focus on the ways to bring the maximum possible the maximum possible pressure on the UK government to have that agreed process. And just to go back to a previous point Anthony made, he's absolutely right that there's at least two different parts of this. One is to build the case for that. So within the SNP, we've agreed our National Assembly, which will happen in 3 weeks' time. That will be discussing the Commission on Social Justice, which, if you think back to the SNP's previous process of having the economic side of things agreed at its conference, this is to move to the social justice side. That starts to provide a platform for the point Anthony made about what kind of Scotland, at least what the SNP is saying, what kind of Scotland we should have. And I think that kind of process itself helps to build the case for independence, the credibility in people's minds of what an independent Scotland would look like. And those two things, both the procedural side of things and the building of the case, really have to run side by side.
Mm-hmm. And Keith, the First Minister has said, for example, that she's not keen on a court case to settle whether the UK government even has the authority to refuse a Section 30 order, to refuse agreement on this issue. And there is a court case wending its way through the court just now, brought by just Scottish citizens to see what the state of play is there. What's your feeling about on that? Wouldn't a court case that the Scottish Government won be a big step forward in this process? And wouldn't perhaps a loss, at the very worst, leave us no worse off, and possibly actually highlight one of the problems that Scotland faces quite starkly?
I don't think that's true. It'd be interesting to see the outcome of the current court case, of course. But I do think, and I've said this for many years observing the EU, because people say, one or two colleagues in my party have said the EU is a rules-bound process, it's bound by its legal precedents, and that's how it proceeds. Well, that is true up to a point, but the EU will also follow the politics. And I think the politics are far more important than the legal rulings that are given. That's not a suggestion to say we should move forward in an illegal way, but I do think that the law tends to follow politics, especially in an EU institution, so in a multi-member institution. The politics is the most important point. So the thing that we have to focus on more than anything else is getting that number of supporters up, and we have done tremendously well, up to 54% in the latest opinion polls. And the law has to reflect the reality of the right to self-determination. If we have a majority for that, and if we get the referendum and we achieve that, then the law has to follow that. That's the political reality. So I don't think it's the most pressing thing to do, but I do think it's important, going back to the point I made before. If we get to the next election, there's a resounding majority of independent supporting MSPs elected, and we still have a refusal from the Westminster government, then there's a whole host of different things which should have been worked on beforehand, are being worked on, and which should be brought into play in terms of bringing maximum pressure on the UK government. I think the pressure is ratcheting up in any event, and the biggest pressure we have is that increased support for independence itself. Because the UK government, much diminished in the world after leaving the EU, has to have an eye on how it's perceived internationally. And to be seen to be setting your face against the democratic demand by a apparent majority of people for independence in Scotland is not a good look for the UK. And the work that's been done by both Nicola Sturgeon and our ministers now over a number of years in the European capitals, in Washington, in Canada, in China, in Japan, has really put to the fore Scotland's aspirations in this regard. And I think it becomes untenable very quickly for the UK government to set its face against that in the face of a completely unquestionable mandate.
Now, Anthony, to come back to you, you have obviously a great deal of knowledge of the EU. Pete Wishart suggested in his blog that the EU might be leaned on to add legitimacy to a referendum if it were the case that the UK government just continued to refuse any sort of cooperation. How likely is it that international bodies or even individual countries outside the UK might offer some sort of tangible support to Scotland if that problem does persist?
Mm-hmm. I think it's important to be realistic here, that the European Union or the wider international community will not want to get involved in this debate. This is an internal debate within the UK, but obviously within Scotland. It is up to the people of Scotland to decide whether or not they want to become independent. And of course, if they want to have the right to make that choice, then they should have that choice. But the EU will not want to get involved. The fact that the UK has left the European Union does not change that. And I think it's important to recognize that fact. And indeed, important not to do anything that would diminish Scotland's existing relationships with EU actors, so with the EU institutions and with the EU member states. Scotland has these relationships, and by Scotland I mean all of Scotland, the Scottish government of course, but wider Scotland, from academia, business, civil society and so on. Links and relationships that have sustained bilateral relations between Scotland and the different member states of the European Union. Those are extremely important, both currently in the Brexit context, but if Scotland were to become independent, those have to be focused on things that aren't about the Constitution, aren't about independence. They need to be focused on things where Scotland and those countries can work together, things like climate change, renewable energy, well-being, recovery from the coronavirus. Those are areas where, even though Scotland isn't independent, it can work with other member states of the European Union, other parts of Europe, on projects and on initiatives that make a real difference. And that is the way to sustain bilateral relations with countries in the European Union, not going around asking for support about independence, because they will feel very awkward about that, and that frankly that would damage Scotland's relations with other parts of Europe. And so I think it's really important not to do that, to minimize trying to bring the EU into the independence debate, to focus on things where Scotland can already work together as it's doing with the European Union. And then if or when the people of Scotland vote for independence, then that is the point to engage on that level and to think about how Scotland would apply to join the European Union and eventually become a member state, and crucially, as I've written a lot about, become a successful member state. Because I think that is definitely possible, but it requires everyone to work really hard to achieve that.
Now, Keith mentioned this question of how Scotland will look, or how Britain will look, if it does continue to effectively keep Scotland prisoner, if there is a sustained majority for independence, but no opportunity to express that democratically. To what extent will the international community voice any sort of opinion on that, do you think?
I think it's hard to predict, because it depends on how how things go. What the UK government's response is, for instance, after the next Holyrood election. I wouldn't, Boris Johnson is not a very truthful person. So him saying that he would never support another independence referendum, I don't necessarily believe him on that. And indeed, if the people, for instance, at the next Holyrood election, return a decisive majority in favor of an independence referendum, he is ostensibly a democratic politician. He has an obligation to act on that, just as David Cameron did in 2011. So I think it remains to be seen what the UK government will actually do in the face of that result. But I think the international community will try its best not to get involved. And I think it's important not to be frustrated or angry with the EU or with the international community that they don't want to get involved. This is a question for people in Scotland to decide. And it's just not something that they want to be part of. It gets very messy and very complicated, and goes against the basic principles of international relations that you shouldn't engage on the internal affairs of a country unless there's an extremely good reason to, like there's a conflict situation. And obviously we don't have that here. So no, they won't want to get involved. But I think it's important that we don't get angry at them for that. It's about just playing by the rules which exist in the international system. They may not always be fair or just, but they are the rules that exist. And the whole reason we have the rules-based international system is to ensure the sovereignty of smaller states and medium-sized states against the interests and the whims of larger states. And of course, if Scotland decided to become independent, Scotland would be a smaller state. The international system would be crucial to Scotland. So it's in Scotland's interest to sustain that system, to contribute to it, and to engage in a way with the international community that shows the kind of state that Scotland would be if it were independent, and not bringing the constitutional debate into that before that vote happened.
And Keith, this question of what happens with Boris Johnson, I mean, lots of people have looked at the way Boris Johnson carries out politics at the best of times, but even looking at polling, it seems to do him good to be seen to be, bringing the hammer down on the rebellious Scots. Do you see any chance that after a big, potentially a big SNP win at next year's election, that he will change, but just based on the difference in the politics on the ground?
Well, I think you have to be plain about the fact that Boris Johnson is already, in the early months of his premiership, have a reputation for U-turns, like today, for example, on Highway, and also previous U-turns. So, yes, I think there's no question that Boris Johnson's mind can be changed. I think both Nicola Sturgeon and Alex Salmond have said as much in the past from their knowledge of him. And also, I think, as the politics change, if there's substantial support, as we now see, for independence, majority support, and that's growing. And also, I think I saw a poll today saying that there was majority support in England, in both Labour and Tory supporters for independence for England, then Johnson's not immune from that kind of pressure. So I think there's every chance he changes his mind on a regular basis. So I think that we have to be alive to that possibility. And just going back to Anthony's point, I agree with him up to the point of 2014. The EU did not want to get involved. It did get involved, but also made very explicitly political statements against Scottish independence. So the EU, and he was the head of the EU, they did. But I agree, they generally will not get involved. But that was mainly because they didn't want to involve themselves in the internal affairs of a member state. And the UK is no longer a member state. And I know, I've seen the change myself. I worked in the Committee of the Regions for a number of years. And then as a minister going across to European countries, the difference in attitude, senior members of political parties, maybe not explicitly, but very clear. One senior German politician said to me, just on the aftermath of the Brexit discussion, we like our Scottish friends, they want to stay with us. And also you've seen the statements from Guy Verhofstadt, for example, in the European Parliament. So it may be true of the EU as a monolith, they won't want to get too involved, but individual countries, I'm not comparing Scotland with Croatia and the circumstances in which Croatia became a member of the EU, but Germany acted out with the EU and recognised Croatia. So I think there are a number of individual actors, and the EU acting as a bloc is not as relevant as it was back in 2014 because, of course, the UK is not part of that bloc anymore. So there are always these possibilities. And it all stems from democratic legitimacy. If you have that majority support and you win the referendum, first of all, it's very hard to refuse that referendum for the reasons that Anthony's laid out in terms of international norms. But if you win that referendum, then that answers the questions. And that's really what we have to focus on. Rather than, as we sometimes see just now, people dividing amongst ourselves. This is the point at which we can really bring that pressure to bear. This is closer to independence than we've ever been. And I've been at this game now for 35 years or more. This feels as close as we've ever been. So if we can stay focused on that, then all else can be dealt with. If we win the vote, we win the majority of opinion in Scotland, that's the key to this, and then move on from there.
Mm-hmm. So you think there might be some, at least tacit support from other countries. The Craig DL, we mentioned his blog earlier. He wrote a very lengthy piece explaining kind of step by step how he thought political pressure could be ramped up on the UK government. And that included everything from increased public protest all the way to civil disobedience. How prepared is the SNP to lead a campaign like that?
Well, I'm no stranger to civil disobedience. I refused to pay my toll on the Skye Bridge, for which I was fined and given a conviction. I was against the poll tax and refused to pay that. I remember going on a bit of direct action down to the headquarters of British Gas in London in the 1990s as a candidate because of the standing charges. So these things, of course, have been tried before. I do think there's a whole range of things through which pressure can be increased if we have a recalcitrant UK government. And I think things like somebody talked about a National Assembly and public protests. And for example, you could have a coalition of every politician at all levels in Scotland, councillors, MPs, MSPs, don't have any MEPs before, but all sorts of bodies where they believe in the right to self-determination, not necessarily in independence, but they believe in that democratic right, and we can bring real pressure to bear through that. There's a number of other things, and I'm not particularly certain that it's wise to tip your hand before you deploy those measures. But there are a number of things that we mentioned before, legal case. There's all sorts of things which can be tried in that circumstance. But let's lay the groundwork for whatever we have to do in terms of pressure, but let's focus on building support. It's difficult just now, I know, because we can't go out campaigning the way we like to do, knocking on doors. But you still see support for independence increasing. A lot of that, I think, if we're honest, has to be down to the performance of the First Minister. But it's not all Nicola Sturgeon. Jackson Carlow's been very helpful as well, if we're honest about it. But if we continue to focus on building support, everything else stems from winning that support in the first place. And I think we're doing better than we've ever done before in relation to that. And let's keep pushing on that.
And Keith, on the kind of political point of that, is it, you think, for the SNP to take a lead on these things, or should non-party groups be taking more of a lead on maybe making that visible protest, that visible face of independence for Boris Johnson to react to?
Oh, the SNP has no monopoly on how we achieve independence. I think they are very much in the leadership, and they have been for many years. When I joined the SNP in 1984, there was very few people that joined the SNP in 1984. There was even fewer out with the SNP that supported independence. But we're in a different time now. There are groups across the whole of Scotland. And I think the old "let a thousand flowers bloom" is a good idea. And some of the best initiatives, the best ideas, the best activity during the referendum in 2014 happened from those out with the SNP, albeit in that sense under an SNP umbrella to an extent. But things have moved on. The Yes movement's much more mature, it's more varied, more diverse. And I think we have to tap into every part of the Yes movement in order to make sure that we win this. This is going to be the biggest campaign of all of our lives, all of our political lives. This is absolutely crucial. And I think we have to have everybody being used. And to add to your point, I mean, the marches, I went to many of the marches, the All One Barra marches, and those are a great thing for people's morale. Those that were there had a fantastic time, even in that rain-soaked one in Glasgow, the last one that we had. So that brought together a lot of people, many of whom had never been on marches before. And I know that especially towards the end. The Glasgow one, paradoxically, I met more people on that had never been on a march before than any of the previous ones. So I think if we can all face in the same direction in this, but let's use all the talents and all the ideas that we have.
Mm. Now, Anthony, if I could come back to you again, we're still some way from achieving any of this. We have seen, obviously, the polls appear to have turned, and we have seen some sustained period with a majority for independence. Obviously, we still have a lot of polling to do to be more confident about that. But then we also have seen we've also seen big gains for the SNP in various polls. How does your report see us, Scotland as a nation, getting from where we are now to the point where we can realistically demand a referendum and expect to have it happen?
Well, I think the point of the first part of demanding a referendum, I think that's quite simple. It's the result of the Holyrood election and the mandate that derives from that. Every opinion poll suggests that there would be a pro-independence and a pro-referendum majority return to the next election, and then I still have some hope that in the face of that win plus majority support for independence in opinion polling, that the UK government will see sense, recognize the democratic reality, and respond positively. But if they don't, then yes, it's a question of building unity, as Keith said, unity across Civic Scotland about the importance of being able to exercise the right to decide, regardless of your view on independence, and engaging in London, to be frank, because that is where the UK government is. That is what Westminster cares about itself. So yes, engaging there, focusing your activities there, I think makes a lot of sense as well. So yes, I think it depends on how the UK government responds, because you obviously need to have a process that will lead to independence, lead to real independence.
Mm. And Keith, we've seen a number of new political parties popping up. One just today, in fact, announced it's going to be standing on the list in the election next year, with a view to kind of skewing the election result towards a more pro-independence parliament. What's your reaction to these new parties emerging? Parties that don't appear to think that just voting SNP is enough anymore?
Well, I think, first of all, just going back to the previous point I made about the diversity of the Yes movement, I have to say that this is a democracy in Scotland. People have got the right to form new political parties to take a different point of view. So that I'm trying to maintain a respectful dialogue when that happens can be difficult, but I think that's important that we do that. But secondly, I think it does mean that those that I've talked about kind of gaming the system, especially in terms of the list vote, I think they underestimate the electorate. The electorate, I'm not saying they would never do it. I think in 1997, the general election, I think there was a bit of tactical voting going on there, certainly. But I don't think this, first of all, I don't think it's guaranteed. They seem to base their case on the fact the SNP will win a huge majority of constituency votes and do extremely well. And I'm hopeful that will be the case, and current polls say that. But I think we underestimate at our peril what we're about to see from the unionist side, the different parties in relation to the campaign they will have. They know what's at stake in the 2021 elections as well. So I don't think you can assume that. And I'm also the deputy leader of the SNP, and I believe the best way to do this is to have both votes SNP. The first vote and the second vote is not a second preference, it's a list vote. Do that, and if you can do that, as we did in 2011, we end up, as current polls show, with a majority of independents supporting MSPs in the Scottish Parliament. And I do think if you divide, and people have got the right to do that, I have to emphasise that, then I think the chance of blunting that message, as perhaps happened to some extent in 2016 in a list vote, that can undermine what you try to achieve. So I am for 2 votes SNP. You would expect me to say that. I'm in the SNP, I'm deputy leader, but people have got the right to do these things if that's what they choose to do.
And what's your response to people who feel that the SNP has maybe not pushed as hard as it should over the last couple of years? I mean, we heard a lot from the First Minister saying that we wouldn't be taken out of the EU against our will. And here we are, we left the EU at the end of January. It now looks like we're going to get to December where we leave a lot of the EU's apparatus following this transition, potentially without any sort of deal, and we still won't have had that referendum. How do you respond to people who feel that the SNP has dropped the ball over the last couple of years?
Well, I think this tends to form a pattern of accusations, which also tend to include things like either Nicola Sturgeon or sometimes myself are not sufficiently devoted to the idea of independence. I think what she has done, and certainly what I've tried to do, is to try and continue to build support for it. That's, to me, as I've been trying to say throughout this programme, is the absolute key thing. So talking to other people about how they might want to support independence, and I would have to say during the course of the events you've described the last year, the difference that I've seen is unlike any difference I've seen before in terms of some areas, and was always going to be crucial, those that were no voters previously, both in terms of the European elections last year. I know people that had never voted SNP or for independence before that voted SNP last time because of how they felt about Brexit, and they liked the SNP's messaging on that. And similarly, I think people are seeing now the way that the Scottish Government's handling the COVID-19 crisis and the absolute shambles which is in contrast in Westminster. So I think those things are working for both the SNP and for the notion of independence, Scotland being able to look after itself. And I don't think there's any diminution on the part of either Nicola Sturgeon or myself. I'm not in government. I've not been in government for 2 years. I was in government for 10 years. And like everyone else who joins the SNP, you sign up to two things on your membership card. One is to achieve sovereignty, to achieve independence to the people of Scotland. That's what I'm in this for. That's why I joined the party in the first place. But the second part is to serve the interests, further the interests of the people of Scotland. And that's what the Scottish Government both does and is duty bound to do. So those are two different things which I think are being followed by the SNP in government. And I think that's a good thing. I think they've achieved huge benefits for the people of Scotland since 2007. But the one that we all want to achieve, the one that unlocks all the other benefits, of course, is independence. And I don't think there's any diminution, any lack of support. And I think Nicola's taken the decisions that she thinks are right, both for the country and for the opportunity to get that independent vote as soon as it's practically possible. You can see the frustration every time she speaks on things she wants to do that are prevented from doing so at Westminster. The latest one, of course, no borrowing powers. So we can't properly grow our way out of the recession which is coming. So I think the first opportunity, the first realistic chance to have independence, we will take that. And I think what we've been doing up to now is building towards that.
Mm. Now, Anthony, obviously there's a certain sort of fixed part of this timeline taking us up to May next year when we expect the Scottish election to happen. What's your thoughts on a timeline after that? How quickly do you think a referendum can be held, negotiations held, and actual independence declared, if that's what the Scottish people choose?
Well, I think it will depend on what the circumstances are at the time of the election in May, for instance, in terms of the coronavirus and what has happened if there is regrettably a second wave, for instance, and so on. So it's hard to say what the circumstances will be in May, but there's that. But I think it's perfectly clear that the referendum would be held sooner than it was in terms of the time between the 2011 election and the 2014 referendum. I'm sure it would certainly be faster, not least as provided the Scottish governments can agree, we know exactly how the process could go. So I'm sure it would be feasible to see a referendum, within a year of the Holyrood election, potentially. I do think it's important to leave sufficient time for there to be a full debate, a full campaign and a full debate. I don't think it should be rushed per se, because the only way, not just to achieve a significant, as I've written in the report, significant and sustained majority for independence, but to lay the foundations for a successful Scottish state, is to fully consider in detail some of the issues. That's one thing I wrote about in the report, and I completely stand behind the point that some people make that we shouldn't talk about EU membership, for instance, because some people have different views. You might support independence, but you're not really sure whether maybe Scotland should join EFTA instead or not join anything and sort of float like a semi-detached island like the UK. So we shouldn't talk about the issues. I disagree with that completely. I think the only way to build that significant majority, so on the order of 60%, and it's clearly possible, is to convince people that independence is feasible, that we have interesting thinking, and we have detailed thinking, good ideas about how Scotland would be as a state. And I think we need to have time for that. In terms of the negotiations on independence, if there were a referendum and then people vote for independence, I think we need to think about that more. I think that how the transition should be researched and conceptualized a bit more. I'm certainly interested in doing that. I wrote about it a bit in the blueprint. I think that after a vote, the Scottish UK government should have an agreement on the negotiations, which would structure everything and give some clarity, both of how the process would go, that the Scottish UK governments were agreed on how Scotland would be engaging with the European Union and other international institutions during that transition period, because that would be important. And I suppose that framework agreement could also include the UK's commitment up front that it would recognise Scotland as a state and so on. You could put all that uncertainty out of the way and have an agreed process from the beginning. But it would certainly take time. And it's important not to rush those negotiations either. The key crucial point is that if the people vote for independence, that it would happen. And to do it in a way which would set Scotland up for success.
Mm. And given what you've seen from the UK's negotiations over leaving the EU, do you have a lot of confidence that negotiations could be done fairly, done in good faith, with positive outcomes for both sides?
I think that the Brexit negotiations have shown that if you have clear objectives and you are well prepared, that you can run circles around the UK government, as the EU have done. So I think, as I have no doubt would be the case, if the Scottish government would have a very clear set of objectives of what it wanted to achieve in the independence negotiations and was well prepared to argue those points, I think that if the UK approached that in the way they've approached Brexit, that the UK would undoubtedly sign up to that because of its lack of own substance of what to do. I think that in particular Boris Johnson, both in words and deeds, he talks rhetorically about his commitment to the union and so on. I think in practice, the substance behind that is not very. There's not much substance. I think that if the people vote for independence, I imagine that the UK will accept that and go through the process and then move on. But no, I think that it might be challenging because obviously throughout the Brexit process, the UK government has not been a constructive partner, always acting in good faith. But I think the Scottish government, being well equipped, would be able to get what it would need from the process to ensure that Scotland could become an independent state at the point of independence with international recognition and resolve some of the issues. But it does also link to the broader question. I think this is important as well. It's in the paper that I wrote. It's not as if people voted for independence. It's not as if Scotland could just detach from ever caring about what happens in England and Wales, Northern Ireland, but mainly England. It matters for Scotland that England is as stable as possible, that England is as connected to the EU as possible. And of course, the best example for this is Ireland. Obviously, even Northern Ireland aside, Ireland is very interested in what the UK does because it's important for Ireland's interests, and that would be the exact same thing for Scotland. Ireland is the country that is most affected, the EU member state most affected by Brexit. Now, if Scotland were independent and an EU member state, it wouldn't be Ireland that would be most affected by Brexit. It would be Scotland that would be the EU member state that was most affected by Brexit, at least economically. Obviously, Ireland has political challenges with Northern Ireland, but in economic terms. So it matters to have there has to be a relationship between the Scottish government and the UK government, even after independence. There has to be a relationship that works, where you can actually achieve things, and it's important to try and work towards that.
Yeah. So Keith, this question of timescales becomes more and more pressing, given what we're seeing from the UK government now trying to run a bulldozer through the devolution settlement. How concerned are you that we get to May next year and some of the avenues that the Scottish government might wish to pursue have actually been closed off in the interim by the UK government?
Well, I'm not sure that would necessarily apply to the avenues for the expression of support for independence. I think, first of all, the SNP also has to have its discussion as to, what process, how quickly, how you prosecute the case. But going back to the previous point, if you look at 1997, Labour government came in with a commitment to have a referendum and had it later on that year. So, and also given the work that Mike Russell has done and the Scottish Government have done in the referendums bill already, there's no practical reason why this can't take place very quickly. The real issue is the political one of the UK government. But again, I don't think there's any things which are insurmountable about that. I mean, if your point is that each day that passes, we're suffering from being in the UK under this UK government by closing down opportunities, that has been true ever since at the very least 2016, because young people in Scotland, I know many young people, just felt that their world got a lot smaller overnight in 2016. And we've seen jobs leaving, and we've seen people having less opportunities. So none of this is good. None of this Brexit process is good. None of the government of Boris Johnson has been good for us either. I agree entirely with Anthony that we have to try and find a way to make sure that we have got the most constructive, beneficial relationship with England and the rest of the UK as possible. Probably much easier to achieve that in the aftermath of an independence referendum than it is in the run-up to it, because nobody wants to say on the UK side, oh yes, we'd agree, we could have an agreement on this, that or the other. Whereas I think a lot of agreements would make sense after independence between Scotland and our UK or England. And it's in both our interests, as Anthony rightly says, that we both prosper and both get on. So I think there is real urgency now. There's no doubt. There's been urgency for a long time. I've been wanting to see independence the next year, ever since I joined in 1984. And we've never been as close to it as we are now. But there's no practical reasons why we can't bash on with this as soon as possible with the mandate in 2021.
Well, no doubt this whole discussion will continue in blogs, in articles, and hopefully here on Broadcasting Scotland as well. But unfortunately, we are pretty much out of time for this evening. So thank you very much to Anthony Salamone and to Keith Brown for joining us this evening. And thank you for joining us as well. We have these shows so that we can have the discussion with the wider Scottish public. And you're a big part of that. So thank you very much for joining us. If you're able to support Broadcasting Scotland, we would very much appreciate it if you can go to broadcastingscotland.scot/register. Sign up there as a supporter, and your £5 a month helps us to be the kind of broadcaster that we think Scotland deserves as we move towards whatever future is coming for us. If you're not able to support us financially, we do understand it's not an easy time for any of us, but you can still help us out. You can follow us at Broadcast Scot on Twitter. You can find us on Facebook. Just search Broadcasting Scotland, or if you're on the web, you can go to facebook.com/broadcastscot. Follow us there and share the shows around. You can be our marketing team. Tell people why you watch Broadcasting Scotland, what you think is good about Broadcasting Scotland. And hopefully you can bring some of your friends, your family, and other people you know into the Broadcasting Scotland fold. And finally, there is going to be a lot of work needs done here at Broadcasting Scotland as we continue to grow and develop. Just talking about the election next year, for example, we want to be at every count if we can. We want to have a lot going on here in the studio as well. That's going to take people. So if you're interested in any way in getting involved in broadcasting for a better Scotland, then please do get in touch with us. We would love to hear from you, whether you want to work behind the screen or in front of the screen like me. But that is absolutely all we've got time for. So once again, thank you very much to Anthony Salamone from European Merchants and to Keith Brown, MSP. Anthony, just before we go, if people want to read your report or hear your podcast, where will they find your stuff online?
They can find everything at merchants.scot.
Well, that's ideal. And Keith, if people want to join the party, do you want to get involved in the independence movement, how can they do that?
Various ways, but smp.org will take you on there, and please feel free to join the biggest party in the UK. Excellent.
Well, that is absolutely all we've got time for tonight. We hope you enjoyed this slightly different midweek show. We'll be back with another Scotland at 7 tomorrow. And then Gordon, of course, will be back on Thursday. But until then, thank you very much for joining us. Have a lovely evening. Good night.